Today is the 1st of July, 2014. And the title of this is, How Can the People Who Believe in Democracy Limit the Growing Police State, sometimes called the federal government? My guest is David DeWitt, columnist for the Athens News, and I am Robert Whaley, retired historian who used to teach at Ohio University. And this is the Athens Speakout, number 315. Now, by the way of introduction, I have published 2 books of history of the international relations. And my first book was entitled Hitler and the Spanish Civil War, 1936 to 39. And it was published rather late in 1989. And my second book was an e-book called The American Intervention in the Yugoslav Civil War, 1991 to 1999. And to give you a little background of that, because this generation probably remember that war, George Herbert Walker Bush, the first Bush, Bush 41, didn't get involved in the Yugoslavian Civil War. He said, we don't have a dog in this fight. But the war began in 1991 in his administration, and it began as the Bosnian Civil War. And the United Kingdom and NATO and France began to intervene through the United Nations, and they were trying to be peacekeepers, and they were trying to contain this civil war. And they began in 1991, and they continued on into 1992. And then Bill Clinton was elected, and he escalated American intervention through American air power. And he was a little bit tired of the slow military action of the United Nations peacekeepers and the European pillar of NATO, and wanted to speed up the conclusion of that. So it then became the Yugoslav Civil War, and Yugoslavia broke up into 8 nation states when it was all over. And the United States began bombing off and on, and the main target was Belgrade, the historic capital of old Serbia, and was the capital of the Federal Socialist Republic of Yugoslavia, and is still the capital of the new Serbia. Anyway, the fighting began in Bosnia, and the United States taxpayer had to pick up the bill for this, but it was the European pillar of NATO, mostly Germany, who gained the economic advantage as a result of this intervention. The U.S. senators and the State Department were debating about the gradual escalation of this war, and the President of the United States under Clinton gradually pressured France and Britain and Germany to expand the war through the State Department, the CIA, and the National Security Council. Now, Clinton argued that he was trying to protect the Yugoslavs from ethnic cleansing. I thought that was a phony excuse. And at the end of the war, American prestige has been weakened by this intervention, because the State Department had to manipulate the General Assembly and the Security Council votes, and the United States was a kind of a imperial power, an informal imperial power, or what the French call the Great Hegemony. Officially.
Dr. Whaley, can
Yes.
I ask a question?
Yeah, sure.
What do you believe was the real reason that we intervened into that Bosnia?
Well, I think it had to do with oil. I think it had to do with Dick Cheney, who wanted to have a military base in Yugoslavia, and the United States oil companies were making a pipeline from Georgia and the Caspian Sea, and it would empty out into Bulgaria and come across the Black Sea to Yugoslavia and then be exported to the European market. That's what I think was behind it. Now, Halliburton was making money regardless of who was president. So I think Halliburton was one of the major factors. And
How do you suppose Richard Cheney influenced William Clinton to...
Cheney didn't have anything to say. It was the CIA and the State Department.
Okay.
The CIA has an oil desk, and the State Department has an oil desk. And Clinton was captive of the bureaucracy. Clinton was only a minor governor from a minor state called Arkansas. And when he got there, he had to follow the State Department line. And of course, the State Department line was to break up federal socialist Yugoslavia. And that would give more profits to the German market. And Croatia was leaning toward Germany, and Slovenia was leaning toward Germany. And it was the United States who, with NATO, were trying to intervene in that war in order to eliminate any socialist power in Europe. This is an aftermath of the anti-Soviet.
Now, Milosevic.
Milosevic was a socialist. Milosevic was the Yugoslav socialist prime minister or president. And he was also the president of the Serbian Socialist Party, and Serbia was the dominant power. They were like the Russians in relation to the Ukrainians, the Estonians, the Latvians, the Lithuanians. There were 16 nationalities in the old Soviet Union, and there were 8 nationalities in socialist Yugoslavia. And the Croats were strong enough to question the authority of the Serbs. The Slovenes were the most prosperous, and they started to look for moving into Europe. So Slovenia won economically. Croatia got its independence. Bosnia is still a mess. The problem with Bosnia is that 44% of the people are Muslim. 31% were Serb, and 17% were Croat. Well, if the United States didn't intervene, and if NATO didn't intervene, if Milosevic and Franjo Tuđman, who was in charge of Croatia, if they were really in charge, they would have just petitioned Bosnia and made the Bosnians second-class citizens. Because the Bosnians are Slavs in ethnic background, but during the long occupation of the Ottoman Empire, several centuries, they became converts to Islam. Now, the Serbs are very Orthodox in religion, and the Croats are very Catholic in religion. So religion counts. And Clinton, of course, and the American State Department said, oh, religion doesn't matter. Well, it matters more in the Middle East and in the Balkans than it does in the United States. That's a lengthy answer. But I'm an American citizen. I'm an American taxpayer. I didn't gain anything by this. But Clinton was somewhat of a success in the fact that he carried on that war with only about 7 or 8 American casualties. It was the British and the French and the Germans who had to sacrifice the land peacemakers, with a UN flag, okay? But they were kind of thankful that the American Air Force came to their rescue and forced Serbia to surrender. And of course, not Hillary Clinton, but Madeleine Albright was the Secretary of State, and Richard Holbrooke was the major domo running the diplomacy here. And Clinton was more or less going along with what Holbrooke and Madeleine Albright were talking about. So that's how the State Department wags the president's dog. They're supposedly the tail. But Clinton had no voice in controlling that State Department. Okay, well, that's the problem of imperialism, intervention. Anyway, the result of that is that the Bosnian Civil War set a bad precedent for George Bush 43, who started to intervene in Afghanistan and Iraq under the pretense of ethnic cleansing, stopping ethnic cleansing. And those were bigger disasters for the American people. And I think even the Republicans and the Democrats are tired of any new war now. One thing that did come out of this is that I think George Bush will go down in history, George Bush 43, as the worst president of the United States so far. Of course, there could be somebody even worse. But anyway, to get to the Middle East balance of power, you have 4 big Muslim states: Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Turkey. Now, the other states, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Pakistan, Afghanistan, are trying to get sovereignty. And the whole Middle East is unstable, filled with terrorism. And Bush has no idea what to do. And Obama just inherited the mess from Bush, and he has no idea. And he's already a lame duck president. But he's lucky to survive in the next 2 years without some kind of an escalated crisis. Anyway, now Israel is a unique state. It's the only state with a Jewish religion in the Middle East. And most of the Arabs and most of the Christians know little about the other religion. And the Methodists and the Baptists know very little about Jewish religion and the Chinese and Japanese religion or any of the Muslim countries. So they're dealing with total ignorance. And anyway, I've been teaching diplomacy for some years, and I always raise the question to the students: how do you preserve democracy? Ever since 1961, how do you preserve democracy? And how are the American people being subjected to this gradual creeping police state? Because to run an empire, you have to have a spy system and a police state. Anyway, I guess we ought to let our guests speak now here. My guest is Dave DeWitt. And my first question is, when and where did you obtain your high school diploma?
Well, thanks for having me on, Bob. I graduated from high school in 2003 from Lakeside High in Ashtabula, Ohio, up on the lake east of Cleveland.
That's while Bush was getting into the
That
war.
was, yes, March. The March right before I graduated is when we invaded Iraq.
Right.
I remember the announcement.
And the Yugoslav situation was all history to you. And you didn't pay much attention to that in grammar school.
I was aware of it because one of the major bombings that happened was on the same weekend, the same day as Columbine, actually.
Columbine.
The high school shooting in Colorado in '97, April 20th, I believe it was.
That's interesting. And you studied Columbine. In other words, your class in Lakeside were kind of panicked about Columbine.
Right, and I've always been a big news reader and person, and I was a Model UN geek, so I knew
Oh, I see. Okay.
all about the international stuff going on.
Okay.
So I was vaguely aware of it. I didn't understand much of it, and still don't understand a lot of the Bosnian situation.
Well, I don't know if this question helped or made it more complicated.
Yeah, right.
But a historian looks to the deep roots, and the journalist has to approach it from the top and look down into the bottom of the sea
Right.
to find out what's going on.
Yes,
Anyway, you came to Ohio University for your BA.
I did.
You got that in journalism or in communication?
I got a BSJ in journalism in 2007 from the Scripps School.
From the Scripps School. Well, journalism is, in my opinion, better than communication. Because you got to do some reading.
Yeah, a little.
So did you take any history courses or political science courses in getting that degree?
I took a lot of history
Good.
courses and political science.
Let's describe some of those.
Well, one of them was War and Its Causes.
War and its causes. Who
was-
taught that?
I feel bad. I forget the professor's name at this point. But we did.
You talked about World War I
Well, that was one of them. Yeah.
and World War II.
And I did a report on the Civil War.
The
as
American
well.
Civil War.
The American Civil War.
Okay. Well, those are the three big ones from the American point of view.
Yes, very much so. And here we are with.
So how many causes are there to war? What did you conclude?
Well, it's funny because you mentioned the difference between history and journalism, and I always had a tendency to look at it from a journalism perspective, and
Who fired the first shot?
right, that type of thing. So it was always a tension with those classes, but the class was focused on looking into everything from superficial situations to psychological causes and motivations like that.
Did you ever look at economic causes?
Yes, yeah, that was
Okay.
part of it too. They tried to take a comprehensive look.
And the political causes.
Right.
Well, those are the two major factors. And then, of course, the third factor is military causes.
Mm-hmm.
Unless you have a general, and unless you have a politician looking for votes, and unless you have corporations looking for money, it's like a three-cylinder engine. You got to have those three
Right.
cylinders, and then you got to have a fourth one, which I call ideology, religion, or philosophy. You got
Get
to
the fanatics on board.
you got to have an excuse of why you're going to war.
Right.
Why should you volunteer for one side or the other? Well, in World War I, the Germans were fighting for Germany, the French were fighting for France,
Right.
and the British were fighting for England, and the Russians were fighting for the Tsar and Russia, and they all exploded.
Yeah.
It was a great catastrophe. Five
Yes.
empires committed suicide.
Yes.
And nobody won the First World War.
Right. And here we are in the 100th anniversary this year.
Well, that's a good war to look at. Anyway, you have enough history to continue and with this problem of today. Let's look at it from the point of view of the presidency. Who was the first president you ever voted for?
Well, I turned 18 in 2002, so the first presidential election I voted in was in 2004. In the primary, I was a Howard Dean guy.
A Howard Dean guy.
I supported Howard
Well,
Dean.
you were a hereditary Democrat. Your father was a Democrat.
Actually, my grandparents My grandparents on my father's side were blue collar Union Democrats, and my grandparents on my stepfather's side were academic Democrats.
What did they teach school?
My grandfather was the dean of the Kent State University branch in Ashtabula, Ohio.
That makes you a liberal or a leftist, or
Yeah.
maybe even a socialist.
And then my mom's parents were Republican. But even
So
though
you were a little bit objective.
and even though my grandparents were mostly Democrats, my father is a very hardcore Republican. And
What, was he in business for himself?
No, he's manages country clubs. He's in the
Oh,
hospitality
well, okay.
business. Yeah.
So taxes and bureaucracy, that's,
Yeah, so
he's getting sales.
we get to
I can understand that philosophy.
yeah. So it
He
is
doesn't
a
have
big
to know
mix.
anything about foreign policy.
Right.
Let somebody else pay. Okay, well, that's pretty good.
Robert knows
Yeah.
about that sort of thing. His father was a Republican.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Yeah, my father
Yeah.
was a Robert Alfonso Taft Republican.
Oh,
I
yeah.
graduated from high school in 1948.
The anti-New Deal
That's right.
Republicans.
And Truman was then president when I graduated. No, he was elected he was president because he was vice president.
Right.
But he was
Then
elected in a very
48.
famous election in November.
Dewey defeats Truman.
Yeah, but everybody
Right,
thought
the
Dewey would
paper.
win. see?
Right.
Well, anyway, that's a little. In other words, from my father's point of view, there are only two issues: taxes and bureaucracy. Because he had a small independent trucking business,
Oh, I see. Yeah.
and he hated Roosevelt and the ICC because they were regulating his business. You see,
Right.
and he had to pay taxes, and he didn't like unions because he was an independent operator.
Right.
And he didn't want some low-wage, big line with 35 tractor-trailers cut into the business, you see.
Yeah.
He was against the railroads and against the big tractor-trailer companies. Mm-hmm. And now, this gentleman over here used to work for Federal Express.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Federal Express didn't exist in the 30s. The big line was called the Kiesinger's Motor Truck Company.
Oh,
It
okay.
was in Chicago. Mm-hmm. That was the largest trucking company in the United States at that time.
Oh,
But there were many, many small tractor-trailer companies
right.
with 80 trucks, 50 trucks. I guess, what does Federal Express have, thousands?
Yeah. Plus all the planes and
Yeah, big business.
ships.
But yeah. Well, anyway, we're kind of getting off the tangent of how people vote and why they vote for. You were a hereditary Democrat. You voted for Dean, and I voted for a guy even further to the left, Dennis Kucinich,
Oh, yes. Kucinich.
because he was pacifist.
Yes.
Dean was kind of pacifist,
Yes.
but he wasn't. He needed that.
He wasn't as far to the left as.
Well, you see, he needed the center vote a little bit.
Right.
Kucinich since Kucinich started out as a working class labor leader, he could defy the banks of Cleveland.
Right.
He didn't care.
Right.
So he would said exactly what he believed.
Yeah.
But Dean
wanted to appeal more to the center to try to win the nomination.
he was a kind of a middle of the roader. Anyway, so I guess we've got the major issues.
Still
here.
more liberal than John Kerry, though, or left.
That's true. That is true.
Yeah.
And we now have John Kerry. Okay, let's look at this from the point of view of going backwards. If you voted against Bush in 2000 and going backwards to Clinton or going forwards to Obama, what did you think of those? Either way, you can go forwards or back.
Yeah.
What did you think of the election of 1992 as a journalist or the election of Obama in 2008? Which way do you want to go? as a journalist?
Well, I had much more experience. By 2008, I was working in Washington, D.C. for the Atlantic Media Company, who publishes The Atlantic and the National Journal.
That's a very liberal journal.
Yeah, the Atlantic is. The National Journal tries to be a little bit
You mean
more
they were the
objective.
same corporation?
It's all under the umbrella of the Atlantic Media Company, yeah. So I was working for them in D.C. and covering the 2008 elections at that point.
You mean you were a beat reporter, went out on the street?
I was working out of the Watergate building, actually.
Out of the
yeah,
Watergate
in
building?
the Foggy Bottom in Washington.
And how did you interview people? You talk to senators? Or?
Well, mostly at that point, what I did was I worked for a newsletter that was an aggregation of all the political news in the country. But the New York Observer, in the summer of 2008, started a new website called Politicker, and they hired me to move to Columbus, and I covered the entire 2008 election from Columbus. I was
For Ohio only?
For Ohio only. So I traveled the campaign trail.
You were looking at a lot of polls?
I covered congressional races, the battle for the State House. I went to Obama and McCain events and covered them when they appeared at high schools around the state. And so I was much more involved in the 2008 campaign.
That's considered the 2008 campaign. Well, Obama won. Why do you think Obama won?
I think a couple
Did he take
things.
Ohio?
He did.
He
yeah.
took Ohio.
He took Ohio both elections, 2008 and 2012.
Yeah.
I was in.
It was close, though, in Ohio.
It was, yeah.
Did you predict the victory?
I did. I thought after what I think that the economic crash that happened in that September, combined with
People were getting tired of the war and the taxes for the war.
people were getting tired of the war.
Tired of the deaths.
I think John McCain made a fatal mistake
Stupid.
Selecting Sarah Palin as his running mate. And I think that all those things combined were, and aside from that, Barack Obama's message of a new, a new
face.
era, the hope, that fresh face candidate always has
but there's
an advantage.
a black burden. Not many whites are going to buy that.
Well, yeah,
And there are 88 counties in Ohio. Did
and
you
if
go
you
to all
recall,
88 counties?
Probably not all 88, but I went to most of them. And you could tell even in the Democratic primary that year that there was that issue was used as a wedge for the blue collar voters.
Yeah.
And that that issue's been used as a wedge for a long, long time in American history, as you well know.
Getting worse.
Yeah. Yeah. So that was especially in the primary in South Carolina.
Right.
Where I believe Bill Clinton noted that.
So what
Jesse
did you
Jackson
think were
won
the
that.
major issues in the 2008 campaign? How did you see it?
I think the biggest issue was the economic collapse that was happening that fall.
Unemployment.
Yeah,
People were feeling that.
Foreclosures were skyrocketing. People were
Okay.
being thrown out of their homes.
Right.
The economy was crashing. People lost half of their pensions.
So even some of the Republicans were beginning to get a little wet feet.
Oh yeah, yeah, and war fatigue. People
Okay.
were very tired of the war at that
That's
time.
probably the second major issue, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I guess you want to say anything more about that? Okay, we'll finish with that topic. Let's go on to another one then. We're halfway through? Well, we have to have a station break here. I'm talking with David DeWitt about how you use history and political science to inform good reporting as a journalist. And I think that David DeWitt has been a good journalist for the Athens News. And I guess my next question to him, I'm Robert Whaley, historian, and we like to kind of inform the viewer who tunes in late or sees this late who we are. And so I'm going to ask Dave his next question. What did you learn from Terry Smith and Jim Phillips when you were working for the Athens News?
Well, I've learned a lot of things from Terry and Jim. They've been excellent mentors for me, especially as I've gotten into newspaper writing itself. Because before I was writing a lot for a lot of online
Right.
media outlets, and they've really taught me just a lot of the nuts and bolts of the profession, how to handle certain situations and how to respond to things, and also just how to be a pro, how to approach the job and be responsible to your sources,
Right.
be fair
Right.
to various sides,
Right.
and to maintain the integrity of the newspaper reporting above all else.
Right, right. Okay, so I guess Terry Smith gets most of the protests and the letters, the editor,
He does, yeah.
because he writes an editorial,
Right, yes.
and you don't do too much editorializing.
Not in the actual physical paper. I do a political blog online where I share a lot of my opinions about politics, but most of the time that doesn't actually appear in the physical paper, so
Right.
it doesn't get nearly as many reads as people
Right.
reading the paper around town.
Yeah, right.
But usually, the negative feedback hopefully goes through Terry first.
Okay. Well, looking back at the war, why do you think that George Bush 43 and Vice President Cheney invaded Afghanistan in 2001? What was their objective?
I think they probably thought about it a little bit differently. I think that Dick Cheney had motivations that George W. Bush might not have. Not that he didn't share the motivations, but he probably had a more ideological way of looking at things. Whereas
Who was more ideological again?
I think George W. Bush might have believed some of the rhetoric that he was saying with
Okay.
regard to, but I think Dick Cheney has more of a comprehensive plan to try to maximize the United States advantages in the Middle East with regard to natural
Well, I would
resources.
say that they were both interested in the oil industry.
Right.
In other words, Cheney has direct influence through Halliburton,
Yes.
and
And he made a lot of money off of it.
they both come from Texas.
Yeah.
That's unique in history. The vice president and the president comes from the same state. They used to balance the ticket from George Washington's day up.
Right.
Robert,
Yeah.
Richard Cheney claimed he was from Wyoming, I remember.
Well, that's a little bit
Oh,
phony.
right.
Phony.
Right.
He moved out of Wyoming down to Texas, got in the oil
I
business.
understand that, but what I'm saying is, he used that Jackson Hole address.
Yeah, fine. It fooled some of the people. But a historian looks a little deeper.
Yeah.
But you see a difference between Cheney. Cheney,
I do. Well, I think that Cheney was very much acting on the interests of his Halliburton business
Yeah.
and the oil interests. And I think George W. Bush was to an extent. But I think where Cheney might have been more shrewd about using political rhetoric to motivate the populace to get them to support the war, I think that George W. Bush probably believed some of the stuff that he was saying about bringing democracy to the Middle East and things like that.
oh, I
And-
doubt it. I doubt it. I don't know if he even knows what. I doubt if either one of them ever read the Constitution.
It's not
Yeah.
very long. Shouldn't take much time, but
No, I think they're both for profits. They're
Yeah.
both for Wall Street. They're both
That-
for the
well,
oil.
that's-
They're both for oil.
yeah.
Now, what Cheney has is the inside line to CIA and State Department. He's got his fingers on the bureaucracy.
Right. The deep state, as they call
Yeah,
it.
the so-called police state that I'm worried about.
Yeah,
I think that Bush just delegated all of that.
right.
Bush was.
Well, Cheney was one of the most powerful vice presidents
That's true.
that we've seen.
That's right. I think.
And I think that it's very telling that after his presidency was over, their relationship has deteriorated quite a bit. and they.
I think that the retired Bush is beginning to talk to his mother and father.
Yeah.
And they're saying, hey, you were lucky to get out of that.
Yeah. Because as I understand it, there's not much love lost between those two
Yeah.
at this point.
Yeah, now. Okay. Well, anyway, they had a different connection with Karl Rove.
Right, and then there's Karl Rove.
Yeah. Well, I guess we've said enough about that. Well, let's change the subject to Iraq. Why did Bush and Cheney and the Congress vote to invade Iraq? Supposedly, Afghanistan was revenge for the 9/11 attack
Right,
in 2001.
right,
They're supposed to find Osama bin Laden.
right. Because the Taliban was supposedly
supposed-
training the Al-Qaeda
That
terrorists.
looked good to the public.
Right.
But why did Iraq suddenly they invaded? What was the excuse?
Well, they kept moving the chains on that one, didn't they? First, it was that Saddam had helped the terrorists, and then it was that he had weapons of mass destruction, and so they kept moving the chains as far as how to convince the public. And then Colin Powell gave that famous presentation to the United Nations that was just a pack of lies, really.
Well, were you?
And I think that it was fairly. I remember.
You saw through the thing from the very beginning.
I remember being very excited in high school and going up to my Model UN advisor and saying, I'm going to write this big exposing article about how this is all about oil. And he was like, Dave, of course we all know it's all about oil already. You're not going to expose anything here. A lot of people already know this.
But you were never afraid of weapons of mass destruction.
No, I wasn't. And I wasn't afraid of Saddam. Now, that's not to say
Well, that's
that
very sophisticated at such a young age.
The Baathists weren't, a fascist and
Right.
repressive regime, but I
Right.
was not afraid for American
Right.
security in any way.
Right. Well, I think you handled that well. You don't have anything further to say about the lost war?
I don't think we should be going back.
I agree with that one.
Yeah.
So why is Obama stalling?
I think that there are, and this goes into the national security state that we're going to talk about with regard to
Right.
the police state and the surveillance state. I think that there really are powers in this country beyond our elected officials
Sure.
that motivate the
Right.
behavior of our elected representatives
Right.
more so than anything that the populace thinks. And I think that
That's true.
Obama has found himself just as beholden to those interests, continuing the drone strikes, continuing the security state, the surveillance
Right.
state, the police state, continuing much of the foreign policy,
Right.
altering it slightly, but continuing much of the foreign policy of George W. Bush.
Okay. Right. Good. So what papers do you read in order to keep up with the news? Do you read the New York Times?
I do. I try to read all the big traditional media,
Times? Washington Post?
Times, Post, even the Wall Street Journal, even
Wall
after
Street Journal.
Rupert Murdoch bought it.
Columbus Dispatch?
I do read the Dispatch.
Well, that's a lot of reading.
With the media age these days, you can get everything, so you get all the headlines directly to your phone or your computer.
Right.
And so I can get I can cast a very wide net and get a wide variety of sources.
Okay.
So not just those, but some of my favorites include Mother Jones.
Mother
and,
Jones. That's way on the left.
Yes, it is. Yeah. And
Yes.
I got a question for Mr. DeWitt. When you were in Washington, D.C., did you read both the Washington Post and the Washington Times, or just the Washington Post?
It was part of my job to look at the headlines of the Washington Times and make sure I was aware of what was going on there. I would be more prone to actually read the full articles in the Post than I am the Times, because sometimes I get aggravated when I see obvious slants.
Well, the thing is, those two you're thinking that if you were to read one and then read the other, you'd think you were reading two different stories.
Oh yeah, absolutely, yeah. But I like to read. I like to read papers that don't necessarily align with my own thinking, just because I like to be aware of what they're telling the public on that other side, and that way I can be better prepared to respond to it.
Right.
Do you have time for TV?
I watch. I like to watch PBS actually.
You
Bill
watch that?
Moyer's show is
Oh,
fantastic.
Bill Moyers is the best show on there. Yes.
It is, yeah. That's my favorite. But I also watch.
But he's
I'll also
only on
watch
once a
Charlie Rose. Yeah, yeah.
You watch Charlie Rose.
And then I watch a lot of the educational stuff that they have on there.
Okay, but you don't have any loyalty nightly to look at NewsHour. You
No,
can skip that.
not necessarily. I'll watch. I don't mind NewsHour, and I'll watch it occasionally, but I don't make sure to watch it every night.
It's I had an interesting experience with that. I went away to Europe in 1993. I had my last sabbatical. Mm-hmm. No, it was not 1993. 1993, I took my sabbatical in Washington. But before that, 7 years before that was, what, 1980s?
Yeah.
Yeah, 86. I went away for a year. I was living in Spain and in England, and I was doing research over there. And I read the German paper and I read the British paper.
Oh yeah.
And I was just out of contact with the United States. Once in a while, I would read the Paris Herald Tribune. You know the Paris Herald Tribune?
No, I'm not familiar.
Well, back in the 1920s, there were enough American exiles in Paris that the New York Herald Tribune, which was competing with the New York Times then, set up a Herald Tribune in Paris. And they got American newspapers for all of the travelers, okay? Mm-hmm. And then when the Tribune went bankrupt, which was about 1965 or so, the Times and the Post bought it out. Oh. So you can get news releases from the Post and the Times every day in Europe, printed in English, published in Paris, and then they have copies in Berlin and Madrid and all places if you're in America.
Right.
So once in a while I'd see that paper, but for the most part I looked at the Guardian, which is a left-wing paper.
Right.
In
I know the Guardian.
Britain. And then when I was in Germany, I looked at the German paper, Stuttgarter Zeitung, and I was practicing my German.
Right.
And when I was in Spain, I read El País, which is they got New York Times in Spanish.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Yeah, El País was getting more liberal because the Franco regime was dying, you see. And when Franco died in '75, there was a big move to the left, okay? And then it got bigger in 78, I think. Well, anyway, what I was going to say about American TV is when I came back and I picked up TV, it seemed like I didn't miss a beat.
Yeah.
They were talking about the same thing the year before.
They do that. They get very repetitive.
Repeating. You know,
I personally don't watch any of the cable news networks.
Yeah. Well, the cable is more interesting than the NewsHour.
Yeah.
Because they have some radical leftists there. You know, did you ever look at Hayes? Christopher Hayes?
I know all about Chris Hayes and Rachel Maddow and
they do
and
nation
even,
stuff.
Yeah, I just don't like to watch
well, you can look at it in the Nation.
I'd prefer to read or
that's more informed, yeah.
to see Bill Moyers just sit down one-on-one.
Okay, well, let's get into Snowden. We've been horsing around here.
Oh yeah.
Did you have any opinion about the FBI, the CIA, before Ed Snowden came along and hit the headlines?
When George W. Bush, actually ever since the USA Patriot Act in 2001, I have been railing against the decimation of our Fourth Amendment rights.
Right.
And not just the Fourth, but it seems like the only amendment that gets attention in this country is the Second, but there's 9 other ones that are very important,
the First Amendment
including the Fourth, the Fifth, and the Sixth.
The First is the most important.
And the First, which, as a press man,
right,
I'm big on. But ever since the USA Patriot Act, I've been publicly calling into question
Sure.
the erosion of our Fourth Amendment rights.
And there was only one senator who voted against that from Minnesota.
Right. Yeah. Isn't the gentleman who died in the plane wreck, right?
No, that's no. It was his successor. He's
Oh,
still
his
around.
successor, okay.
A Jewish guy. What's his name? It slipped my-
Franken?
No, not
No.
Franken.
No, he was later.
No. He got defeated in the Wisconsin
Yeah.
slide to the right.
Okay.
And he's now raising money for somebody else.
Okay.
I'll think of it 2 o'clock in the morning. Well, anyway.
Yeah. But yeah, it's been a big concern, and long before any of these Snowden revelations came about, it was a big concern of mine. In fact, one of the reasons why I was supportive of Barack Obama was because in 2008, I went to a rally in Columbus, Ohio, where he appeared at a high school gymnasium, and he said that if you elect me president, I am a person who taught constitutional law, and I will uphold the Constitution of the United States. And, you know, I thought, well, that might be possible. And then he was elected, and he continued some of the worst policies.
Guantanamo still
But
open.
he promised in that speech to close Guantanamo.
Yeah.
He promised to end the Bush-era assaults on our Fourth Amendment rights.
Right.
And he didn't do any of that. And to me, that almost made it a lot worse because it meant that this is really entrenched establishment stuff now. We have presidents of
Right.
both parties who have made this the new normal, and
Right.
and I was very distraught when I realized that was going to be
So
the case.
Snowden was not a big surprise.
It was not. I was very happy to have the evidence out there in public, though, because
Okay.
a lot of us had been talking about this for a while, but we didn't have all the evidence to back it up, and this was a torrent of
Right.
evidence.
So, what motivates him? What do you think Snowden is trying to do?
I think he's trying to shine this. We talk a lot in journalism about shining the spotlight, and I think that he was very much trying to shine the spotlight on a situation that, in a democratic republic, a population has to be aware
Right.
that their government is doing this type of things, and I understand the security aspect of you don't want every detail out there, but we also have to remember that it wasn't like WikiLeaks where he just unleashed all the information and everybody could have it. He went to responsible
Right.
newspaper outlets such as The Guardian and
Right.
Glenn Greenwald, and they've been pouring through and releasing, and they've only released a very small percentage of the information
That's
that he
right.
has, and they've been very selective about it
Right.
because they've been protecting some of the more sensitive security stuff.
Right.
But the goal, I think, is to let the American people know what their government's doing. I think it's an admirable goal. It's the whole focus of journalism.
Right.
And we've got, in a democratic republic, you've got to have the population that's well informed in order to hold their representatives accountable the way
That's
they should
true.
be.
That is true. So,
Did Greenwald know about Snowden's actions?
oh yeah, he's absolutely
Well,
essential.
I mean after the fact, but I mean, did he know that what he was going to do prior?
Well, he went to
Oh.
Hong Kong, you know.
Yes.
You
Oh,
remember this?
yes, yeah. Before
Okay.
he went to Russia, yeah. He was in Hong Kong.
Greenwald was like where in Brazil or
No, Greenwald is a
based in
correspondent for the Guardian.
Yeah.
for the Manchester Guardian?
Yeah, for the London Guardian.
Yeah.
And he's without Greenwald there would be no Snowden.
Right, that's what I was going to say.
Right.
So he tried to get exile. He tried to get protection in Hong Kong because it was British. But the CIA and the MI6, MI5 cooperate, and they said, "No, you're not going to leave him in Hong Kong. You got to arrest him."
Yeah.
So then there were these other helpers, Julian
Assange, the WikiLeaks.
right?
Yeah.
Right.
He's Australian.
And they tried to get him to go to Ecuador. No, Ecuador wouldn't do it. And they tried to get him to go to Sweden.
Mm-hmm.
But the British intelligence, the American, tracked him down into Sweden. Said, "Well, if you ever go to Sweden, we'll arrest you for sex crimes." So he couldn't go to Sweden.
Right.
Well, the thing was, I didn't know that maybe Greenwald had, after this developed, that Greenwald had come along later and to assist him. I saw in Time magazine just recently, and perhaps you two guys did too, where an ex-CIA agent had said that, you know, and I don't know if this is any indication of what maybe the United States wants to do, but
Well, they're
he
going
said if it was up to him, that Edward Snowden would go down, but,
yeah, well,
Oh, I'm sure.
he's being threatened with the Espionage Act.
Yeah.
yeah, so.
Look at what they did to Bradley, now Chelsea Manning. I mean, they threw him in the brig with no contact, you know, basically solitary confinement for 9 months or more,
Yeah, I think so.
something like that. So I think that when Snowden contacted Greenwald and the Garden, they were very aware that these things were going to happen, and they tried to work out the best way to go about things that they could. But, you know, of course, they're facing the most powerful government in the world. So you can do what you can, but
Well, do you have any more details that you would like to say about Snowden and Glenn Greenwald and
one thing that I want
Assange?
to point out that
Yeah.
a lot of people don't understand about the Fourth Amendment, and one thing that I think we really need to fix in this country, there's this thing called the third-party doctrine, and it comes from 2 Supreme Court cases in the 70s where they say any information, it was Smith versus Maryland and Miller versus the United States, and they say any information that you turn over to a third party can be seized by the government without a warrant, right? So they subvert the Fourth Amendment through that way.
This is the Republican court appointed by Reagan and Bush.
Right, this is 1979 here. So it's the Supreme Court of 79.
Well, Nixon got rid of
Yeah.
the Warren Court, and
Right.
we had the Berger Court.
Right.
And so you're saying...
And so, but the thing is, we're still operating under this third-party doctrine, even though it's, 35 years old at this point, and it was referring to, you know, snail mail and telephone lines, right? But everything that we do on our smartphones and our computers with email and everything, we offer up all this information, our bank accounts, our
Right.
Facebook profiles, our communication through text, all of this goes through a third party because we need to go through Verizon
Right.
or Apple for our phones and stuff. So that means that all of this information becomes open to the government without warrant, without any protections of
That's
the Fourth
right.
Amendment under
right.
this third-party doctrine. I think it's very antiquated law, and I think that it's deeply irresponsible for us to be continuing to operate under 35-year-old law when we're living in the 21st century with all this new technology, and Americans have a right to privacy, and we need to figure out how to protect ourselves. And we need to demand through our democratic republic that we be protected and that our representatives make sure that that's the case.
Well, I'm with you. You ought to say this a little louder in the news.
I do on my blog, but that doesn't get printed.
You do it on your blog. It
Yeah.
doesn't get printed.
Yeah.
In other words, the
I only get
editors are
about.
afraid.
Well, I could print some of my blogs, but
Well, who reads your blog?
I probably get about maybe 700, 800 reads per blog.
Wow.
But that doesn't compare to,
You mean
20,000 reads in the paper.
Other journalists out in Wisconsin are reading it. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. It's all online. I've got a lot of progressive fans in Ohio.
I
but,
see.
That's, it only reaches, 800 people compared to.
Most of the 800 are in Ohio.
Mostly, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, but they could come from anywhere. I mean,
Right.
even the Athens News is read a lot in Greece because people think that we're Athens, Greece.
Well, every once in a while, we see letters to the editor from some guy from Colorado saying that
Yeah,
he was
right.
a BA at Ohio University and he misses it or something.
Right. Yeah.
Some strange letters.
So I'll try to get more columns in the paper for you then.
Okay.
I can write about this
that'd
stuff.
be interesting.
Yeah. I also write
well,
for
we
Thunderbug.
only have a couple of minutes now.
Okay.
So could you kind of summarize what our major theme is here? What have we been trying to accomplish?
Well, I think the question that you asked at the beginning is, how can the people who believe in democracy limit the power of the police state? Democracy in our republic has been a struggle since the very beginning. Women weren't able to vote until the 1920s.
Right.
So we're always struggling for democracy. Democracy simply means that you give as much power to the people to choose to self-govern how they want. Now, we have a representative democracy, so there's always this struggle. And I think that the way that the people who believe in democracy limit the power of the growing police state is you demand appropriate representation from those that we elect.
Right.
I wouldn't compromise on any of this. I think that we need to hold our elected officials accountable, and they need to be accountable to us, the people, and not the deep state or the Secretary of State's office or the CIA, but the people who elect them. And there's a lot of work to be done, and it's going to be a long struggle. And the battle's never really over because, as you know as a historian, the battle rages on long before we're alive and long after we're dead.
Yeah,
But
well, I was a very optimistic person in 1948 because democracy and Christianity won the Second World War, and I thought communism was the threat. Mm-hmm. And gradually, as I investigated communism, I discovered that imperialism is a greater threat because imperialism was the causes of World War I and World War II.
yes,
And in order to defeat, now you see, Stalin played the imperialism game kind of cleverly.
yes,
He denounced imperialism, but he was practicing imperialism at home.
right. The
And-
rhetoric didn't match the action.
And communism was a kind of cultural imperialism. Mm-hmm. Well, all of that I had to learn the hard way, so to speak. And unfortunately, the Vietnam War was a turning point for me. And I think that after Johnson and Nixon, democracy is in deep, deep trouble. And it's declining.
It really
Because
is.
the senators have become rubber stamp. So my favorite candidate for president was George McGovern, and I read his memoirs, and I
72.
recommend that everybody read the McGovern memoirs, and why it is that a liar like Richard Nixon was able to defeat an honest Christian in '72.
Yeah.
That's a lesson to be learned.
Hunter Thompson wrote a great lament in the Fear and Loathing on the Campaign Trail, '72.
Who is this now?
Hunter Thompson.
Explain him. I've heard of the name, but
He's
I
a
forgot about
gonzo journalist, just a radical new journalist along the lines of Gore Vidal and Norman Mailer. And
I see. He has his own blog.
No, he's passed away now. But
Who did he write for?
he wrote for Rolling Stone mostly.
Oh, he wrote. Oh, yeah. Okay. I've seen some Rolling.
Yeah, Dr. Hunter Thompson.
Yeah, I've seen some Rolling stuff.
Yes.
They're very good on finance.
Yeah. Oh, Matt Tiabi does some great work.
Okay. Well, we're going to have to close now. You got 1 minute, and I would just like to conclude that the theme of this show has been that debate is the oxygen of democracy, and you and I are both in favor of debate. And this debate begins in Athens, Ohio. It goes to Columbus, and it goes both religiously, politically, economically, and we have to debate all of the issues. And unfortunately, the TV is one of our great enemies, and I think that internet is even dumber in dumbing down the educational system of the United States. So let's keep the debate going. Thank you for coming.
Sounds good. Thank you very much.